Thanks, Ruben. This is my fourth or fifth, but definitely final event in my 3 days in Auckland. It's the first time I've been back in the country since the COVID closures, and always delighted to be back in the country, which is one of my home countries. And our son, in fact, elder son, never left the South Island, so we'll be making regular trips, the two countries' entry and exit policies permitting. But because this is the fourth or fifth event and it was all done in a rush at the end, it's slightly more disorganized in terms of the papers, but my thoughts are reasonably clear that I can find the right space when we move to it. I prefer to keep my remarks short because I'd like to have an open conversation rather than monologue from up here. So let me just start with a restatement of a very familiar mantra for all of us who studied international relations, even as undergraduates. And that is the famous central tenet of realism, that international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. I think that is completely out of date now. And what we have increasingly since 1945 is that international politics is a struggle for the ascendancy of competing normative architectures based on an interplay of power, economic weight, but also principles and ideas for good governance. And that's important because if you think of New Zealand in terms of its size and weight or lack thereof, the opportunities for New Zealand to contribute are on the final third of that trilogy in terms of ideas and principles. And it is there that New Zealand has historically tended to punch above its weight, ignoring the other two because we're not in the same league. And indeed, we are much more vulnerable when it comes to military force and economic weight. And I was here when we were subjected to the non-sanctions by France, if you want, or whatever. So it's worth remembering that in mind. For several years now, many analysts have been commenting on the fraying of the liberal international order that was set up at the end of the Second World War under US leadership, mainly by the West, but not exclusively, and was embedded in the structures and institutions of global governance as well. The international set of institutions and governance arrangements and principles can never be detached completely from the underlying power structure. But what we are seeing now is a twofold development. The security order essentially remains unipolar. The United States is in a league of its own when it comes to the capacity to deploy military force anywhere in the world and attack and destroy any country pretty much that it wants to, barring just one or two maybe. But the global security order has become increasingly, genuinely multipolar. And this creates a problem for the governance institutions as well. And that's going to be one of the major subsidiary themes of my talk. And geopolitically, what we have is not just a shift from the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific in terms of the central theater of world affairs, interrupted rather than reversed by what happened last year in Ukraine. But you have the relative rise, well, both absolute and relative rise of China and the relative decline of the United States. So geopolitically, we face the historical so-called Thucydides trap, where over the past 500 years or so, according to the analysis by Graham Allison of Harvard University, 16 major power transitions, 12 of which have ended in violence and war. So a 75% statistical probability that a power competition does end in warfare. maybe the probability is lesser because there is general recognition, even by the decision makers, that a major war today between the major powers would actually be mutual suicide. And that exercises a discipline that maybe perhaps wasn't there before, but it's not a guarantee. So that's a problem. In our region, that is complemented by the jostling between China and India. And the destiny of Asia, I think, will be shaped by the triangular relationship between China, India, and Japan, the three heavyweights, whose global footprint, the global footprint of that competition, the footprint of that competition will be global rather than purely regional. And indeed, I've seen in the past couple of months, some American analysts now speculating about a possible G3 world, the three being United States, China, and India, on grounds of the three metrics of population weight, economic weight, and military weight. Europe is still important in that analysis, but it remains internally divided and lacking unity of purpose and action, and dependent militarily still very much on the United States. So that's the broad contour against which things happen in Ukraine. And on the India point also, one final point as a preliminary remark, the displacement of the conceptual framework from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific is very much driven by the desire to integrate India into the strategic framework. And just as a reminder, I'm not sure how widely recognized it is in New Zealand, but the so-called Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue Forum, originates from the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, when the only four capable navies that could swing into immediate humanitarian relief and assistance action were those of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. And that experience of cooperation in humanitarian relief was a very positive one for all four. And they discovered an unsuspected degree of interoperability and compatibility. And so they decided to take that forward, and it has had some birthing pains and different iterations, but it's developed and been consolidated, but as a dialogue forum. And the desire of some of the four partners to move it more substantially into a military alliance direction will not succeed, because that goes against the entire grain of Indian history since independence. And so India, unlike most Asian countries, had no discomfort with the announcement of the AUKUS submarine deal, because that can be the military alliance part, and wants to restrict Quad to the diplomatic forum. But it integrates India not just in terms of its military and economic thing, but as part of the free and open Pacific idea. So the Indo-Pacific is very much part of that conceptual rethinking of our strategic environment. Now, what happens in Ukraine is the return of the Russia question as a geopolitical priority, which has also been accompanied by the crumbling of almost all of the entire arms control complex of treaties, agreements, understandings, and practices that had underpinned the stability and brought predictability to major power relations in the nuclear age. And the AUKUS alliance, linking Australia to the UK and the US in a new alliance, with a planned development of AUKUS-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, is, I think, both a reflection of changed geopolitical realities and, some argue, itself a threat to the global non-proliferation regime, which I'm skeptical of, but certainly a stimulus to fresh tensions in relations with China. And so British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said at the announcement of the submarine deals in San Diego on 13th March, that the growing security challenges confronting the world, quote, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, China's growing assertiveness, the destabilizing behavior of Iran and North Korea, threaten to create a world co-defined by danger, disorder, and division, unquote. Now, maybe it's something Indian, but that fondness for alliteration, of course, is very characteristic of Prime Minister Modi. For his part, President Xi Jinping accused the United States of leading Western countries to engage in an, quote, all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression of China. And there are elements of truth in both charges. And that's where things get difficult and complicated for the rest of us. The Australian government described the submarine project as the single biggest investment in our defense capability in our history. That represents a transformational moment for our nation. That said, I'm not convinced it's going to happen in practice. It could yet be sunk by 6 minefields, if you like, lurking underwater. China's countermeasures, the time lag between the alleged imminence of the threat and the acquisition of the capability, the costs, the complexities of operating 2 different classes of submarines. No other country, not even the United States, operates 2 different classes of nuclear attack submarines. So the complexities of that. The technological obsolescence of submarines that rely on undersea concealment. And there's a major study before this announcement by a team of interdisciplinary scientists from within the hard sciences at the ANU, which concluded that by the 2050s, the oceans will be transparent and the evolving technology will be able to detect submarines, which will destroy the only significant comparative advantage that submarines have. And therefore they will be vulnerable. We'll see. But in addition to all that, there's also the question of domestic politics, both in the United States and in Australia. And there'll be, we might have a little bust up at the Labour Party National Conference next week in Brisbane on that issue, although the Prime Minister is trying desperately to take that off the agenda for discussion. You will have seen, I'm sure, the stringent criticisms, for example, from Paul Keating of the whole deal and others. So on the global governance side, not just a question of the disconnect between the power and economic security orders, but also the realization that the existing institutions that we do have are increasingly less and less fit for purpose for addressing and resolving the major global challenges we face. Climate change, to pandemic, to security, to nuclear weapons. They do not seem fit for purpose. So what are we going to do about that? Not the least because the rising and revisionist powers wish to redesign the international governance institutions so that they too can embed their policy priorities, their principles, and their interests into these and relocate some of the control knobs from Western capitals to theirs. In terms of Ukraine itself and what happened, rather than assign blame through a finger-pointing exercise, the moment in history that I want to pick out is the end of the Cold War, Yeltsin in power, and the Americans, or led by the Americans, the Europeans, are contemplating how they can integrate Russia into the post-Cold War European security architecture. At that point in 1993, in October, Secretary of State Warren Christopher had a meeting with Boris Yeltsin and was informed that the United States had decided to pursue not NATO membership for selected European countries, but rather a partnership for peace for all. Christopher was interrupted by Yeltsin who said, "Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, I want to be clear. You are saying that all Central and Eastern European countries and Russia will be treated equally in an all-inclusive partnership. Is that correct?" Christoph said, and I quote, "Yes, that is the case." To which Yeltsin replied, quote again, "This is a brilliant idea, a stroke of genius," unquote. Within a year, the United States changed policy and Russia was frozen out. The rest is living history in which we are all trapped. A second thing to remember about this is India's former National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, in an article in Foreign Affairs, wrote that the Ukraine war will transform Europe's geopolitical landscape, but it's not a transcendental conflict between autocracies and democracies. It will not reshape the global order and has only limited relevance for the Indo-Pacific. China's rise, he argued, is far more consequential for reconfiguring even the emerging global order on both the geopolitical and normative axes than the protracted death rattles of the Soviet Empire that expired in 1990-91. That rejection of the framing of the war as between democracies and autocracies is pretty much widespread, if not in fact universal, across the global South. They see it far more as a European geopolitical context, denounce the invasion and the brutality as illegal and unacceptable, but do express sympathy for the fact that Russia was not integrated into the European order and that NATO expanded to the point where, in the end, the expansion provoked rather than deterred Russia after a series of declarations where they made clear what their red lines were. And Bill Burns in particular, who's now the director of the CIA, in the embassy in Moscow to begin with, and then back as ambassador later on, his cables that were part of the WikiLeaks leaks were very explicit that this is a visceral issue on which all means the entire Russian elite is united. It's not a party issue and it should not be personalized to anyone particularly. Similarly, the framing of it as rule of law versus force is not necessarily accepted by everyone, because not the least, if you look at the actual data and record since 1945, in particular, the United States has bombed more countries, used force militarily overseas in more countries, has more foreign military bases in and more foreign military personnel stationed overseas, and has engaged in regime change through economic and military coercion than any other country by far. 750 foreign military bases compared to 5 from China and fewer than 40 from Russia. The second biggest is actually the UK. And so there is that sense, as I said, in the global South that we need to bear that in mind. I think there is also a greater appreciation in the global South than in Western countries of the equivalence between Russia's reaction to the emerging possibility of NATO relationship with Ukraine and American response in the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you're going to condemn Russia today, I find it difficult to see how you can be consistent and say America was justified in what it did in 1962. 2 sovereign countries entering into a military relationship, stationing of missiles there. And there's a whole sorts of them. The anti-American strain is very easily provoked in many countries. And this ambivalence between admiration for American political values and apprehensions about American tendency to military adventurism and regime change addiction. It's perhaps best captured in a placard in my student days in Calcutta, which used to be the radical center of Indian politics in the Vietnam War days. Yankee, go home and take me with you. So there is that aspect. I think staying with the analogy and in terms of what happened in 2014, and at least a conceivable rather than plausible scenario, think if Quebec did one day decide to secede from the rest of Canada, and the new government established friendly relations, increasingly friendly relations with China, then you have restiveness within the Quebec population and an attempt to overthrow the existing government in which senior Chinese officials are known to be involved. Would the Americans accept that outcome? No way. And they would have very good reasons not to. And yet the distance from Montreal to Washington, I think, is actually slightly even longer than from Kiev to Moscow. So it's just trying to present a point of view that may not necessarily be seen, not to justify, but to explain. In terms of where we stand with regard to lessons, if you like, a couple of things. The addiction to sanctions and the tendency to weaponize the dominance of international finance and trade by the US and by the West more generally is not just creating resentment, but a desire now to actively explore de-dollarization options, which will further diminish US capacity to control world affairs. This may not succeed because there are enormous practical limitations and difficulties, but it's already gone further than I would have expected in terms of, for example, India's bilateral currency swap deals with the UAE and Indonesia most recently, as well as an interest possibly in BRICS currency and the various agreements that Russia has been signing. That's one issue. Contrary to the general opinion, I think the Ukraine war shows at the end of the day, reconfirms, if you like, the limited utility of nuclear weapons. The fact of the matter is all the bluster and threats from Putin did not deter Ukraine from fighting back with great determination and considerable success. So it wasn't a 6-day shock and awe and Kiev surrenders. But that determination and capacity, of course, surprised the West as well. You remember his famous reply, "I don't want to ride, I need tanks," when the Americans offered to evacuate him safely. Nuclear weapons haven't prevented NATO countries from providing increasingly lethal and effective weaponry and armor to Ukraine and expanding their reach all the way in drone technology now even to Moscow. Nuclear weapons haven't prevented Russia from engaging in the first big multi-year land war in Europe since 1945. He threatens, but the threats have diminishing credibility by now. So unless Russia faced imminent defeat, actual defeat, I think it's going to be very unlikely that nuclear weapons are actually used. This has also shown the limited utility under modern conditions of the use of force. And so they're caught in an escalating, but nonetheless, essentially stalemate position and a war of attrition. The deployment of propaganda by both sides, and I mean both sides in this case, more than we've seen in previous wars on our side, means that outsiders really have no way of assessing accurately what the military situation is. What we need is, just as we prepare for the possibility of war in conditions of peace, I think the opposite is also true. We should be thinking ahead to a possible peace deal, even in the midst of war, and look for exit ramps and look for actors who can provide either good faith or at the very least credible mediatory capabilities and opportunities and sites if necessary. And the point at which negotiations can seriously begin will be when both sides have reached a hurting stalemate, mutually hurting stalemate. When neither side is able to achieve its maximum aims on the battlefield, but both sides can go away satisfied that the minimum aims and interests have been protected. That might have to be unpalatably that Russia retains control of eastern Ukraine as well as Crimea. Unlikely, but possible that either one or the other side could actually be defeated. So the military facts on the ground will very much dictate the terms and contours of the ultimate settlement that is reached. But it has got to the point where I think we are going to have to accept going to that point of mutually hurting stalemate rather than impose a temporary truce from the outside. Because I think too much blood has been spilled on both sides for something short of that to be likely acceptable. But we shouldn't forget in terms of the use of force that NATO military stocks have also been seriously depleted in the process. And just as periodic threats for the use of nuclear weapons, in a sense, it reflects the weakness of Russia that they did not anticipate. Similarly, I think the provision of cluster munitions to Russia against the international convention and to Ukraine for use against Russia, and against the explicitly stated objections of some of the key NATO countries, it reflects the sign that running out of some other alternative weaponry to supply to Ukraine for use as they. We shall see. And the questions that led to the war will remain at the end of it as well. The place of Russia in Europe. Is Russia finally a militarily exhausted, not a threat anymore? Certainly, it's hard to imagine Russia being a serious, credible threat to any other European country, certainly to any NATO country after this. Do we conclude that they are finished as a great power? If so, it sets a different menu of options for how we deal with it. But if they remain a great power in temporary retreat, then we need to rethink that. I'm not sure that Western policymaking is capable of that degree and level of honest and hard thinking and coming to a decision. And the notion that a country like the United States should once again present us with a choice between Biden and Trump for president does not fill me with confidence for how we are going to handle all these big challenges, but that's just me. In the meantime, developments out there in the real world, testifying to an inflection point in history, do pose profound challenges to institutions to rethink where we go. Returning to the importance of the global south, I'm not sure how many of you caught the news. Two interesting bits of straws in the wind, if you like, but perhaps more than that. Last year, China overtook Germany to become the second biggest producer of cars. This year, it overtook Japan to become the biggest producer of cars. And this year, a UK-based investment analyst or financial analyst company pointed out that in purchasing power parity dollars, for the first time, the BRICS, the BRICS 5, now account for a bigger share of global product than the G7. That's an enormous change. In 1982, approximately the BRICS 5 accounted for around 10% of global product. It's now around 31.7 compared to 30.5% for the G7. That's a substantial shift that needs to be reflected in their presence at the tables around. In terms of this broader, wider bilateral competition between China and the United States, it seems to me, as of now, we should bear in mind two things. One, before we criticize China for supporting Russia, imagine if you were the national security advisor for China, what would be the implications for your national security if NATO succeeded in defeating Russia? I don't think they would be positive, the implications. So it's very much in their vested interest to ensure that the West also is exhausted in the Ukraine war, just as it is in US interest and NATO interest to leave Russia significantly weakened militarily rather than triumphant in Ukraine. In other words, if you're going to get anywhere with China, at least try and get an appreciation of their hard-headed security interests in this. That's one thing. Secondly, I think China is actually the big strategic victor. Just as the big strategic victor of the US-Iraq war and the occupation by US was actually Iran. It's the third party that gains the most. Russia has become more dependent on China, and the West has become weaker, and the West is disconnected from the rest of the world rather than the other way around. It's the West that is now isolated from the rest, and the rest speaks from a position of self-confidence and strength for the first time in the decades since decolonization. So the new international economic order that some of us lived through, that came from NAM, reflected a position of weakness of the developing countries. Now they speak from a position of strength. And there is no better example of that than the public statements from the ministers from the government of India. Self-confident, not apologetic, not critical of any other country, wishing to maintain all their good relations with all the main parties, and protecting thousands of Indian students who were caught at the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, giving that the highest priority, and giving energy imports inexpensively a much higher priority. And in a CNN interview, when the petroleum minister, who actually is a career diplomat, former career diplomat, who finished as the permanent representative to the United Nations and was on the Security Council, and I got to know him quite well then, he said, "Are you telling me it is immoral for me to ensure that tens of millions of my citizens get their energy for cooking and heating more cheaply? Because for you, it's a lifestyle. For you, it's a lifestyle choice. For my people, it's a life and death choice. So don't talk to me about morality. My moral duty is to my people, not to you. We will source wherever we can at the cheapest rate." And if you read the commentary from Pakistan and China, India's historical quote unquote enemies, many of the analysts in both countries have been very impressed by India's capacity to articulate these with a degree of passion and eloquence and get away with it, with no pushback from anyone. We'd like you to do more, or the criticism has come much more from outside government than from in government. So that's another indication of where we are. And that, in a sense, I think, for me, and I'll finish with that, will probably be the most consequential impact of what has happened in Ukraine. It sort of confirms the displacement to the global south. It confirms their emergence as self-confident actors and looking to one another as much as to the Western capitals for examples of how to respond to the emerging challenges. And if you think of India again, Pakistan is not relevant in this context, but think of the depth and gravity of its challenges in managing China and the way it does it with a multiplicity of cross-memberships and relationships, wanting to promote trade, working with China in the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, working with China on issues like climate change, that yes, as well as climate action, we also want climate justice in terms of historical responsibility, but not prepared to appease China or back away from China in terms of the border dispute and the military realities. And yet, unlike the India-Pakistan relationship, for all the tensions and the occasional flare-ups with India-China, there has not been any expectation in either country or in the rest of the world that it could escalate through the nuclear threshold. So it is, if you like, managed rivalry, but cooperation and collaboration on some issues. And that may be how we end up in the coming decades as the United States loses its primacy, loses its capacity to set the rules of behavior and design and control the institutions. And some of these shift to other countries. The need for more collaborative and cooperative arrangements with the return of the state with harder frontiers than we would have expected, firstly through the COVID years and then through Ukraine. I think that's the world into which we are going, and we are going to have to identify with a degree of clarity of thinking and act with a degree of courage of conviction to improve the world we live in instead of seeing a deterioration and a rise in tensions and possible flare-ups. Thank you.